Hello, friends. It is now November 20th, so we're 2/3 of the way through the Cozy November Writing Challenge, and this is going to be like a deep dive craft video, so get ready. How are y'all doing? I think that I'm doing all right, but it's hard to say because I've bounced between so many projects. I think I'm doing all right, that is, as far as getting 30,000 words. But as far as my goal of getting 30,000 words on the Una and Vari book and finishing it, bleh, terrible. I think that's like the only book I haven't worked on. And part of the reason is that I've been thinking that I need to rethink it. Sometimes you hit a point where you realize that it's just not working. Just gotta bite the bullet and either set the project aside or sit down with it and really dig in and figure out what's wrong. So I thought that's what I would talk about today. A few of you have asked for videos on outlining. What is my outlining process? And I thought that I would talk a little bit about that today and show you what it looks like to really dig into an outline. So usually, I've done different things as far as outlining. Every book seems to have like a slightly different process. I don't have like this one way that I do everything. I kind of work more intuitively. Some books are almost totally like, I have an idea, it's pretty vague. I just want to let the characters play and work it out. And other times I have like a very detailed outline before I even start. But probably my most normal process is to do something like this, like a 1-page, maybe 1 or 2 pages of like just kind of general notes. So this particular page was from back when I was working on Priestess Awakened, which was my first reverse harem fantasy. So I had a lot of characters to juggle, and my thought with it was I was going to base the plot on Final Fantasy IV. So I had like 3 paragraphs here. So this is not really an outline. This is just here's the characters and here's the general premise. And then I just started writing. And I knew that if I got a little lost, I was going to lean on the plot of Final Fantasy IV. So it's pretty common for me to do an outline like this where it's pretty general, and I know that I'm going to wing it to a certain extent and just see what happens once the characters start to develop. And then if I feel like I'm getting stuck, then I'll go back and do a more detailed outline. So that's where I'm at right now with the Una and Vari book. I'm about halfway through, and it feels like some things are working well and other things are not working. So today we're going to specifically talk, at least for me, about the outlining process when it's kind of like outlining, but it's also kind of like working out plot problems midway through. So depending on your style, you might end up doing all of this up front and just executing it perfectly. But for me, it's more like I write that like basic beat sheet of like, here's some themes I want to hit, here's some things I want to happen, here's maybe where I want it to end. But the middle's pretty hazy, and that's where I can get into trouble. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just sit down and I'll start like just really trying to make a firm outline when I get about halfway through the book. And sometimes I don't really need help. Sometimes all I need is to sit down and do it. But other times I'm not quite sure. And especially when you're more of a beginner to intermediate writer, you don't have as much of an intuition about what works in a plot, so you might want to lean on some kind of like template for a plot. And that's what I'm going to show you today, how using a plot template can help you unblock your story and get it more straightened out. So I'm going to work today with Take Off Your Pants by Libby Hawker, which is, a lot of these plot books cover pretty similar ground. There's kind of some general beats that most stories share. So you can use a variety of different templates and workbooks and worksheets to rework your plot. But I like Take Off Your Pants because it's pretty simple. It's easy to just kind of like revisit it without getting too bogged down. But it's not overly simple either. If you kind of like forget the point of why a certain thing happens in a story, you've got a little easy chapter to refer to like, oh yeah, that's what I want to happen with like the character flaw. That's like why this should be here. So the Una Vari book, if you don't want spoilers for it, this is not the video for you, because I'm going to tell you what I've written so far in a vague way, and then we're going to try to figure out how to fix it. The premise is that Una and Vari have a little bit of a thing for each other, but Una, let's say she's a little bit of a Jane Austen heroine in some ways, kind of like a Northanger Abbey situation where she reads voraciously and she has this idea of her like ideal book boyfriend and her ideal man who is tall, dark, handsome, tragic, brooding, like romantic, very sexy. And she has kind of in the back of her mind idea that Vari and her probably would have a good time talking about books for the rest of their lives, but he's not her romantic ideal. Vari is a kind of cowardly guy, but there's been a war going on and a lot of people have enlisted, and then Vari decides, I have to enlist, I have to do my duty, my friends are dying. His parents have been trying to protect him from going to war because they think that he's going to get killed. And his parents are extremely wealthy. They're like the wealthiest people in the community. And they have very high expectations for Vari, which he has never wanted to fulfill. So he signs up, goes off to war. The war ends and Vari never comes back. And they never hear anything from him. Una, meanwhile, has taken his job at the bookstore, which is her dream job, but she's aware that she only has the job because Vari left a vacancy and that he was supposed to come back. And everybody at the bookstore is always asking about him. All the customers miss him. Everybody loves him. So the Keeper of the Dead comes to town. The Keeper of the Dead has the ability to sense if someone has died and when and where they died, if they've died. You can ask him about people's whereabouts. So he's been making the rounds after the war to help people account for their relatives. Vari's parents opt not to ask about Vari. They feel like if he's dead, and if he's not dead, then he kind of needs to prove himself by making his own way back home. They're not going to rescue him. They're not very good parents. Una is appalled by this, and she decides that she is going to ask the Keeper of the Dead if Vari is dead. So she goes to see him, and he says Vari is not dead. So Una decides to go to the last area where Vari was known to be, go look for him, which is the Isti wetlands, basically like a big swampy bayou-y zone near where this battle was fought. Meanwhile, we find out that Vari was injured in the battle, wandered off the battlefield in kind of a haze of pain. His leg has been hit with poison. So he wanders into the swamp and he's about to pass out, and he's rescued by this guy who helps him back to his house. And this guy, Tehran, is a bit of a character. He turns out to be a very powerful sorcerer who worked for the enemy and had this rather nice lake house in the Isti wetlands. But he was blinded in the war, like many of the Darmon race. And the Darmons have a belief that if you are maimed in war, then you should commit honorable suicide so that your soul can be reborn into a new body. But really, they have a financial reason for wanting people to continue believing this. They don't want to have to provide some kind of like disability pension for all the people that are getting wounded in the war. Because about 100 years ago, the leader of the Darmons, the vaunted cult-like figure, Lord Jaren, cast the spell that gave all Darmons blood, this regenerative quality, so that they're really hard to kill now. And this is partly why he became so revered and respected. But the downside part of that is that the enemy of the Darmons, the Miralem, just started maiming them instead of killing them, because they found out that the Darmon have this belief that, you know, if you're disabled, you should just be reborn. But when you have people getting disabled on such a large scale, it starts to become a problem. That starts to be a lot of people, and a lot of their most talented people. So Tehran didn't really want to kill himself. He went to one of the generals and was like, can we maybe change this policy and stop making it out like the only honorable thing to do is kill yourself? Maybe we could still be useful. Maybe we could develop new skills. Lord Jaren and the four generals thought, uh-oh, this could get very expensive. We don't really want to change his policy. So anyway, Tehran retreated to his lake house and is now convinced that Lord Jaren and the four generals are out for his head, because Tehran was going around telling people who were injured in the war that they should not kill themselves, but should instead, live on and adapt and be there for their family, and he became rather unpopular because of that. So Vari's now in the hands of Tehran. Tehran is a very flawed character, but he does have an essential, he's turned against Lord Jaren and has devoted his life to helping his colleagues who have been in a state of despair to bolster their spirits and, in some cases, restore their sight to them. So Tehran senses that Vari has a very rare crystal, because Vari's family got rich mining crystals. And Tehran takes the crystal from Vari and uses it to make potions to restore his friend's eyesight. And because he's taken Vari's crystal, Vari is no longer as able to shake off the poison in his leg. So Tehran is kind of like, well, you don't need it as much as my friends do, and you're going to have to lose your leg. And he amputates Vari's leg. And then Vari is stuck there, kind of. If Vari could get home, the Vandiri necromancers can restore his leg by taking one off a corpse and basically bringing the leg back to life and giving it to Vari. But Tehran does not want Vari to leave, because he's afraid that if Vari leaves, he's going to come back with a bunch of his own people and retaliate to Tehran for stealing the crystal and essentially making Vari lose his leg. So Tehran is now keeping Vari captive, but they kind of become friends. And when Tehran was working for Lord Jaren, he became very enthralled with the movies that they were importing from our world through a portal. And they were starting to develop the technology to make films, and they had stolen some film reels from our world and shown them in their capital city. And Tehran had acquired a collection of these films from our world and was keeping them in his attic. So he shows some films to Vari. At this point, they're silent films. It's like the mid-20s. And Vari's super enchanted by the films. He's never seen anything like this before. He immediately thinks these would be super popular back home. He's already been working at this bookstore and loves literature, but he sees the potential for this new form of storytelling, and he's in love with movies instantly and wants to know everything about them. Tehran has a huge library with all this information that is originally from Earth, as well as other books. Obviously, Tehran can't read them anymore, and he can't see the movies anymore, but Vari can still enjoy them. So Vari ends up staying there for months and watching all of his movies, reading a bunch of his books, going fishing on the lake, basically thriving in this new environment. And him and Tehran become friends, and Tehran is a lot more accepting of Vari than his parents ever were, so they kind of end up, getting along pretty well. The only hitch is that Tehran still doesn't really want to let Vari go home, and eventually when Vari gets the chance to go home, he decides that he doesn't want to. But now months have passed, and Una shows up in the swamp. She sees Vari just scandalously tanned and fishing on the lake, and she's like, what? I thought you were going to be in a horrible state, kidnapped somewhere. So Vari's like, okay, I guess it's time to go home. He comes home with Una, and they all come back to the Vandiri town. The Vandiri, by the way, are kind of like my goth people. They're worship a death religion, and they all wear black. They're they're gothy. Vari has always been a bad Vandiri. He's cheerful. He's too cheerful. And now he's really off the rails because he's been outdoorsy and doing all these not Vandiri-ish things, but he still misses home and is happy to come home. So they drop him off at his apartment. I'm almost done, by the way. It's important that I tell you what I did. They drop him off at his apartment. His apartment has since been leased out to somebody else because he's been gone so long. So he has nowhere to stay for the night. And Una, of course, is like, I guess you can stay at my apartment. So Vari is staying with Una. Una's suspicious of Tarn because he is one of the Colonites, the enemy. And Vari has since told her about the movies. He showed her some movies when she came to rescue him, and he says that he wants to go back and get Tehran's movies and open up a movie theater in the Vendiri district, and Una thinks that's pretty cool. Vari has an idea of an unused building that he wants to see if he can rent out to turn into the movie theater. So the next day they go first to see about Vari getting this dead man's leg to restore instead of a clunky prosthetic, and then they go to look at the movie theater building, and they run into his mom, who is very upset that he's back and didn't tell her, and that he's doing all these other things, and their relationship's a little it's in a few too many different directions. But the main point is that Vari's parents don't really approve of anything Vari is doing or anything Vari has ever done or any way that Vari has ever been. So that's halfway through the book, and my idea for the second half is that they open the theater, they fix up the theater, they open the theater, they fall in love. Vari proves himself. He doesn't need his parents. He doesn't need to be in the crystal mining business. He's going to make his own way. He's going to be his own person, and Una is going to put aside her idea of this brooding romantic man. And anyway, it doesn't sound terrible, but it's not working. So now that I've told you all of that, we're going to talk about why it's not working. So in Take Off Your Pants, what she suggests is that you write down who is your MC and what is their external goal. What is the thing that they are trying to achieve? And that books are basically what propels a book along, is that the protagonist has a goal. They strive to achieve it. They are thwarted in that goal. They might have to shift their goal a little bit. They try again. They're thwarted again. It's that tension of trying to achieve something and being thwarted and finding a different way to achieve it or changing the goal slightly that we readers relate to and what keeps us turning the pages. So you start out with what is your character and what is their goal. So I wrote down that Una's goal is to find Vari and to find a meaningful relationship without sacrificing her close female friendships. And then we have Vari. Vari's goal is to make his own way in the world and be successful without his parents. Then you write down the antagonist. I wrote down that their main antagonist is their inner doubts, that Una is being a little bit haughty and is holding herself and her relationships to a somewhat unrealistically high standard, and that Vari's antagonist is his cowardice. But then there's also Vari's parents as a more concrete antagonist. And then you write down what you want the end to be. Vari and Una are in love with a successful business surrounded by friends. Then you come up with a flaw for each character, which I kind of already touched upon, in that their antagonist is their inner doubts. Una is too haughty and worried over being a perfect Vendiri, and Vari has an anxiety disorder. This is somewhat of a more cozy fantasy, so I don't want to focus too much on an external antagonist, because this isn't the kind of book where they're going to be battling Vari's parents at every turn. A lot of it is going to be about overcoming their own inner doubts and fears. But there is a little bit of an external antagonist. And then she has you write down an ally. The ally is a fascinating part of a well-constructed story, one that is all too often overlooked by writers. The ally is the one who has the power to force the main character onto his correct path. It's the ally who will finally turn the plot toward its climax by backing your character into a corner and forcing him to confront his flaw. Sometimes it can be difficult to identify who the ally actually is. Might be an obvious friend type figure, might masquerade in the guise of an antagonist, etc. Oftentimes in a romance, I think the ally is just within the relationship. Una would encourage Vari to overcome his flaw. Vari encourages Una to overcome her flaw. And I think we will have some of that. But I wrote down, could Tehran be an ally to both of them? Because at this point, he's wedged himself in the plot, and I don't see removing him. He's a pretty interesting character. And he's clearly an ally to Vari. In the draft as it stands, Una is suspicious of Tehran. So I took note as I was going through this book. Is there a way to shift that, and should I consider shifting that? Then there's the theme. The theme is just an something you keep in mind as you're writing the book so that you kind of stay on track with the theme. You don't need to compromise yourself to make your way in the world. That's kind of the theme of this book and many of my other books. And then she has you go through a plot structure. So since I've already written a fair bit of this book, I'm not coming up with the plot structure from scratch. I'm plugging in what I've already written and seeing if it fits the plot structure that is suggested in the book. And if it doesn't, do I just want to stick to what I'm doing, or do I want to reconsider trying something else? And this is where having like a plot structure suggested to you can sometimes help you break through those little blocks. It doesn't mean that a book has to necessarily follow a plot structure. And that's why I often start with a like semi-pantsing approach, because I just like to see the characters do their thing first before I try to make sure like they've got this flaw, they've got this goal, the flaw and the goal, they both tie into each other. And then there's this character that's gonna, you know, facilitate them overcoming. I don't like to be that strict about it, because I feel like sometimes we don't always, like, we can fall into patterns that just feel so familiar and that don't really come from our own hearts sometimes if we just go in with this whole checklist. But when you're a beginner, sometimes you do need it, because that's how you kind of learn to actually entertain the reader and like satisfy them psychologically. But when I got to somewhat of a more intermediate phase, then I just wanted to like write the story and see if it works without thinking too deeply about that stuff. But I can also sense when it's not working and when I might need to go back to one of these structures and consider that I might have messed up. So first, she has you write the opening scene. Una is living alone and has her friends, but she's lonely. She keeps thinking of Ari, her lost coworker at the bookstore. That's the opening scene as I've written it. She's having a little party with her friends. And the opening scene, as she writes it in the book, is to establish like what the character lacks and to show what their external goal is going to end up being. So I already did that. You get the vibe right off that although Una has her friends and she loves her friends, she has her own apartment, she has a job, everything's going well, she's just a little lonely and she really does want a relationship, but you can tell she kind of senses that she's holding herself back. Then you write an inciting event. That's the thing that's going to kick the plot off. She hears that the Keeper of the Dead is in town and decides to go see him and ask about Vari. And of course she finds out that Vari is still alive. Then you set the character up with their external goal. So Una's goal is now to go with her brother Dor down south to look for Vari. At this point, I wrote down, does Una need more ambition? Because Vari is pining after Una somewhat more obviously than Una is pining after him. But Vari also has goals to start a business, break away from his parents, be his own person. Una's only real goal is to like find Vari, and you can tell she kind of likes him, and I don't really have anything else set up for her. So as I'm making this outline, I'm thinking, is that enough? Is that okay? And then Libby Hawker suggests a chapter called Drive for Goal, which is where action happens, where the character moves forward to achieve their goal. So this next chapter, Una finds Vari and convinces him to come home. After this, Libby Hawker suggests that you have a chapter called Antagonist Revealed. Well, in this case, I wrote down that the antagonist is Inner Doubts and Vari's parents. Well, I'm not going to have Vari's parents directly pop up in the swamp, but I am keeping a little note about that in the back of my mind. And if the antagonist is Inner Doubts, then when Una gets to Vari, there should be some kind of confrontation with their inner block. So as I wrote it, as soon as Una shows up, Tehran's like, well, okay, I guess if your girlfriend's here, you know, you might as well leave. And Vari's like, you're right, I guess I shouldn't stay here anymore. He tries to convince Tehran to go with him, and Tehran's finally like, okay, I guess I will. There's not really a lot of conflict there. So is it possible that there could be more conflict in that scene? Maybe Vari doesn't want to leave. Maybe Tehran doesn't want to leave. We'll get back to that. After Libby Hawker has you reveal the antagonist, then something thwarts the goal of the protagonist, presumably the antagonist. So I wrote down as a thwart, Vari doesn't want to leave Tehran without getting his hands on his film so he can bring them back to the Vendiri and open up a movie theater. And then Libby Hawker suggests a scene that revisits the character's flaws. So I wrote down, Una can't just say she wants Vari to come home. She has to act all coy, uncertain. She doesn't want to show her hand that she likes him, even though why else is she there? Now, pretty much the rest of the outline that is suggested in Take Off Your Pants is just from here, it's just a series of drive for goal. The character's trying to achieve something. They're thwarted. Their flaw perhaps stands in the way, and then they have to make some kind of change, or something shifts in the situation where they try the goal again in a different way, or they try for something else. And that's like the push and pull of the story until you get to the end where you have like the climax and resolution. So at this point, I stopped working with the outline. I had gone through the beginning and I had highlighted a few points that weren't maybe working. And here's what they were. 1, should Una and Vari both see Tehran as an ally? Should he be somewhat of a uniting force for them both to change? There's a maybe. Does Una need more of a personal goal than just trying to find the guy that she maybe kind of sort of, I don't know, likes? I think that she does. And then another problem with the book is that early in the book, of course, Vari has lost his leg. That's a catalyst for why he can't come home and why Tehran is keeping him there. But then as soon as he gets back to the Vendiri lands, it's a little bit cumbersome for some scenes because he's having some trouble getting around because he has like a clunky prosthetic leg because they're in a swamp. They don't have a lot of availability of medical care. And then after it just being kind of annoying for several scenes, then they go see the necromancer. He gets a new leg. Ta-da! I felt like this started off as like a plot point that worked and then just totally went downhill from here. So I bounced back a few different ideas. Maybe Vari doesn't lose his leg. Maybe he just gets an injury that he has to recover from. And by the time that he's recovered from the injury, then he's decided he actually wants to stay with Tehran until he can get Tehran to leave with him. But one thing I did like about Vari losing his leg is that Una has this like super romantic idea of like this broody, damaged man and everything. And Vari gets a little bit like, man, Una's probably gonna like that I lost my leg and have to get like a dead guy's leg. She's gonna think that's romantic. And I kind of like that little bit of rapport that Una has to kind of realize, like, actually being injured in war is not really romantic, and having to get a dead guy's leg is not actually a positive thing, really. It's not really the same as your original leg, and probably isn't something that most of us would enjoy. And then I started to wonder, would Vari even like that? Because Vari's not a very good, like, he doesn't follow the rules of the Vendiri society very well. And being a bit of like a anxiety-ridden guy, does he even want to just rush straight to the necromancer and have a dead guy's leg attached to his leg? That might kind of creep him out. So I started thinking about all that. Then I was thinking there's also there's like a little thread that's awkward in there where part of how Vari lures Tehran to come with him to the Vendiri district is that he says, hey, what if, like, you know, I wrote down your story. We could distribute the story and it would help encourage other people to not just give up if they are maimed in battle or whatever. And since that is something that's important to Ron, that's partly how Vari convinces him to go. But that kind of seems like a random side thread because we have Vari's main goal of wanting to open a movie theater, and then like on the side, he's also going to be writing Tehran's biography. So I was mulling all of these things, and it occurred to me, like, there's even mentions in here of Una writing like fanfic when she was in school of her favorite books. What if when Una gets to Tehran's house, finds Vari. She's like, Vari, where have you been? What if Tehran is just resistant? He does not want to leave. I mean, why would he? It would be a totally unfamiliar culture and society and place. And Tehran's a bit of a paranoid guy himself. So he's going to take some convincing. And then what if Una is the one who proposes, hey, what if I told your story? What if Una finds Tehran's backstory kind of interesting and like she could really play it up and make it like this really over the top romanticized version of his story, and Tehran himself, he's a little bit arrogant. He would probably love that. That removes that whole like extra plot from Vari, who doesn't need it. He's already got a goal. Now we have a goal for Una. She's going to write her first book. She finally gets to like write a crazy story based on Tehran's life, which does get even more crazy once he tells her where he actually comes from. And it's also going to be funny just seeing Una like give this real guy story like this super dramatized treatment. Like there's a lot of fun comic relief in that. So that's solving a couple problems. Now Una has another goal. She wants not just to be a bookseller, but to be a writer, but she's never had the right project. Now she can tell Tehran's story, and that will be like her first book. Now Tehran is an ally to both Vari and Una and can help bring them together a little more. And then what about Vari's leg? Well, for one thing, I assumed, and this is something that I find that I do a lot as a writer. I'll just be thinking things through, and I'm like, okay, Vari lost his leg. He's out in the swamp. They don't have a lot of resources. They're not close to a city. They're not going to leave for various reasons. Like all they have is like the swamp market. So, you know, they're probably not going to be able to get like a very good prosthetic leg. It's just going to be like a piratey whatever. That just is my assumption. But as I'm thinking about it, I'm like, well, Tehran I've established is an elemental sorcerer. And I've talked in other books about how elemental sorcerers can shape elemental objects, like stones or wood. So with that in mind, it would stand to reason that Tehran would have it within his power to actually make a very good prosthetic leg that fits Vari and that he could get around a lot better. There wouldn't be so much of him struggling just to get around while action is happening, and I'm kind of like, I need to get him this other leg as quickly as possible, and like it just becomes a cumbersome plot point, almost something that's more of a nuisance and like a flippant little side bit, whereas, you know, he's lost a leg. That should actually be treated more as like some emotions he has to go through. Like, I don't want to be dismissive of it, but I also don't want it to be dragging down the whole book once the like emotional impact of it is no longer valid to what's happening, if this makes sense. So anyway, we can have Tehran shape Vari a very nice prosthetic leg. And then when Vari gets home, maybe he's not really that keen on getting a dead leg, at least not immediately. So then I wrote down a list of things that I think need to happen. One of them is that Una visits her brother, and her brother and his wife have just adopted a Phenarlum, which is my race of doll people, like an orphan doll person baby. And their relationship is not in the most romantic phase because, you know, these orphan babies are very traumatized and they're taking care of this traumatized baby and they're not getting much sleep. They're stressed out about how they can help this baby. So I think that seeing how much Dor loves his wife and the baby they've adopted, even in the midst of like how hard it is for their relationship to evolve in this way, it kind of snaps Una into a little bit of like, this is what's really important. My romantic ideal of like this beautiful, damaged, brooding man does not match up to reality because her brother is kind of brooding and damaged, but this is like what real recovery looks like. It's not easy. Sometimes you're just tired and it's hard to go on, but the people that you love are what sustains you. And Una's just kind of growing up and realizing, like, what does real love look like? Una helps Tehran to tell his story. Then I wrote down, Una tries to help Vari with the theater. Originally, I thought, well, they'll all help build up the theater and they'll open it together and that'll be that. Yay. But here I wrote down, Una tries to help with the theater, and she's quite bad at it. She's not good at fixing up a building. We kind of already know this about her, because when we first met Una, she's trying to run the family apothecary shop in Dora's absence, and she's really bad at it. She's very easily distracted and off in a dream world, wants to read books, is forgetful and scatterbrained, and is kind of like me, except probably worse. So I thought, well, what if she tries to help with the theater and she's just terrible at it? So that's when she ends up kind of like talking to Tehran while all of her friends help to work on the theater instead, because they're all more confident at it than her. And in the process of this, she realizes that Vari is also a great guy for her, because he's getting along with all of her friends and all her friends like him, and she doesn't have to give that up. She always kind of had this idea that, like, when she married this romantic man, then she would have to choose between him and her friends, and now she's seeing that that's not necessarily the case. They can all work together and get along. And then for Vari's part, I wrote down that he needs to get the courage to make a move on Una. He needs to take the initiative in the relationship, I think, because he's the one who has liked her more than she liked him, and he's the one who's been nervous. So I think he needs to be the initiator in the relationship. But at the same time, I think that he actually needs to refuse to get the necromancy leg, because that freaks him out and he just doesn't want it. Maybe later, but not right now. And Una feels like this is the Vendiri way. Surely you want the dead man's leg. But I think that he needs to both romance her and also be able to stand up to her and say, I'm not always going to follow the Vendiri way. So I wrote down a new outline for like the second half. Una tries to help with the theater and is very inept. Vari says, hey, this is not what you're good at. Why don't you chat with Tehran? Start writing down his story. Una helps to record Tehran's story. In the process, the townspeople start poking around, and she and Tehran promote the theater's anticipated opening together, while Una's friends help Vari. Vari gets up the gumption to ask Una to a shrouding, which is like a Vendiri religious ritual. It ends up being surprisingly erotic, and he makes a move afterward. Una asks Dor if he'll talk to Vari about his leg, because Dor also had some of his body parts replaced, so she feels like he could talk some sense into him. Vari tells Una it isn't what he wants. She understands and admires his mettle. He doesn't need to be a proper Vendiri. They go on a date to the literary district and inquire about publishing the Tehran book. And then I get to the climax and resolution, which I'm not going to tell you because I feel like I'll at least keep one little thing a secret about what's going to happen. And also it might change. But anyway, that was really long. So I hope that it was useful to some of you. But basically this was a real time, or at least like some hours later, recreation of my real time thoughts this morning of how I was going through this book, thinking out like, here's what happens. Here's what I don't think is quite working. Here's trying to restructure it. Here's the realization of like the ways that some things might click together a little better based on what seems to be missing or not working. And then write a new outline. And it feels like I haven't changed anything that huge, even though I'm probably going to have to do quite a bit of rewriting. But a bunch of things have like shifted around so that the vibes are all different and they feel like they're going to be a little more cohesive. So yeah, that is one example of the outlining process, and I hope it wasn't too much. You guys kept asking for it, and I'll probably touch upon it more lightly, but I did want to do a video where I really show like, here's what it looks like to rework a draft and make an in-depth outline. So anyway, if you're new here, my name is Lydia Foxglove. I've been a published novelist, mostly making my living via writing since 2009. I've been traditionally published, indie published, and I'd love to have you stick around. Make sure to click that like and subscribe button. I also have a Patreon and Substack, same content on both, and they both have a free tier. The $5 tier gets you access to my Discord, and I'm going to post the outline on my $5 tier so that if you want to refer back to it, I'm going to like show like, here's what it was, here's what it is now, and here's like the thoughts that led from A to B. That way everybody has like a reference for it. And I also wanted to mention, if you have been thinking about trying Magic Mind, which if you've been following my channel, they've been a sponsor of mine for a little while and I love their product. It has made a noticeable difference on my ability to focus, stay calm, and get through brain fog. They have a Black Friday sale going right now, so if you want to check them out, if you've been thinking about it, use my code FOXGLOVE20 and it's a great time to give that a try. And the cat just drooled on me. I would love to know any of your thoughts about the outlining process or how you work through plot problems, how your process might differ from mine. Other than that, I will see you next time. Bye! And as always, thank you so much to my paid Patreons and paid Substack users who are the reason that I'm able to do what I do.